And welcome to the first of a series of programs for gifted students in Year 6 and secondary students in Year 7 to 9, presented by Monash University and the Gifted Student Program. My name is Belinda Leeton and I'm studying at Monash University. Today's program looks at what happens to the dinosaurs before they get to the museum. The program will be presented by a team of staff and a student from Monash University. You will have the opportunity during the program to make contact with the presenters by telephone or fax. I would now like to introduce Dr. Pat Vickers-Rich, Director of the Monash Science Centre and Reader in the Department of Earth Sciences and the Department of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology at Monash University.
You may think when you go into an exhibition in a museum that the bones you see before you may just have magically appeared there. And if you're a scientist and you go into a museum and pull out a museum drawer and see the bones lying there, that they likewise appeared that way. But in fact, there's a story behind them. And what we'd like to investigate today is exactly what happens from the time an animal dies to the time it eventually gets itself into a museum. There are many steps in this process, and there are 3 of us here today that take part in the process of getting bones from the field, and even before that, discovering those bones and getting them into the museum. So what we'll look at is, first of all, how bones are discovered, and then how you actually go about excavating those bones, and interpreting how those bones were deposited, and then getting them into the lab, getting them prepared, and eventually getting them into a museum drawer. And beyond that, we'll also look at what you do with them after that. Some of them go into scientific studies, others of them end up mounted in museum displays that are used for public entertainment, and also for just public education. So that's what this program is about today. Let's take a look at this process of how things are discovered first and then collected, and secondly, how they are interpreted when they're in the field. In other words, how a geologist or paleontologist goes and looks at those bones and tries to make some conclusions about how they were deposited, how the animal died. So Lesley will talk to us about how you actually go looking for bones and how you get them out of the field, and Andre will take a look at how you interpret it once the discovery is made, once the excavation is underway. So Lesley, I'll turn it over to you. You tell us about discovery, excavation, and that kind of thing.
Thanks, Pat. I guess the most common question that we're asked is, how do we know where to find dinosaur bones? And here in Victoria, we're very fortunate. At the beginning of this century, a geologist found some dinosaur bones along the south coast of Victoria. And when we examined the geological maps, we realized that the rocks along that coast were the right age for finding dinosaur bones. So we began looking along the coast, both to the east and to the west of Melbourne, from Inverloch in the east to Cape
Otway in the west. And the thing that was really interesting was the fact that we wouldn't have known the ages of those rocks unless there had been a geologist that was working on it. He wasn't a paleontologist. And people that followed him, that followed Ferguson later, mapped those rocks, and they were mapped as a particular age which dinosaurs occurred in. So then what happened, Lesley can go on and tell you about, was kind of fortuitous. It was not something planned, really, but it was kind of just going on with prospecting.
Exactly. It's part of the prospecting program that we came to then an unnamed cove where we found 3 small bones at the base of a cliff. And in 1984 we began excavating at that site, and over a period of 11 years we removed over 5,000 bones and 2 partial skeletons of small dinosaurs that lived in this area about 105 million years ago.
You know, one of the things that people too ask us, and Lesley has heard this before, is what in the world do you spend 10 years of your life looking for 5,000 bones for? And as people have found, we're looking at dinosaurs here that are very unusual dinosaurs. That's what makes this whole expedition worth going on with and looking for small numbers. It's unusual because these dinosaurs live near the South Pole. So most dinosaur digs would not spend as much time looking for 5,000 bones as we have here. But it's made what we're doing, it's made us go ahead and look for more and more. Now this process involves a lot more than just digging a hole in the ground with a shovel. Lesley's done a lot of work at Dinosaur Cove, and I think she can explain to you what is involved in actually getting dinosaur bones out of Dinosaur Cove.
Yes, that Dinosaur Cove is a unique site in that because the bones were at the base of the cliff, we had to actually remove overburden from the cliff itself, which meant excavating and exploding and removing tons of rock from above the fossil layer, which meant making 2 tunnels into the cliff. And from that, we had some exciting incidents, and the fossil layer itself was underneath the tunnels, which we then dug out and broke up the rock to find the bones, which were then taken back to the museum.
This process too involved lots of volunteers, and we never had too much difficulty getting volunteers because there were lots of jobs to do, none the least of which was exploding tons and tons of gelignite. This was something that excited lots of people. However, this had to be done very carefully. It had to be done with mine managers and with people from ICI who provided us the gelignite, and yet that kind of thing attracted a lot of people. As Lesley and I are both aware, there are probably over 500-600 people that participated in this dig, many of them from primary and secondary schools. We had a number of secondary students and university students that helped us dig these bones up. And as Lesley pointed out, you had to use the gelignite to get the stuff on top off, but when you actually got down to the layer that had all the wonderful small bones in it, that was done with small jackhammers and with little picks and things like that. You had to be very, very gentle when you got down to the layer that had the bones in it. So after that, then Lesley really took over because she was the coordinator of taking care of all the bits and pieces that came out of here. And she can tell you a little bit about what happens when you get some of these bone fragments in rocks and take them out of the field and get them into the lab. Do you want to give them an idea of what you do in the field to be sure that everything is marked properly and we know where it comes from? And perhaps give them an idea of how we discovered a dinosaur in the lab and not actually a dinosaur skeleton in the lab and not in the field.
Yes, not all the most exciting finds are found in the field. Unfortunately, at Dinosaur Cove, the only way we find the bones is by breaking them. Because they are encased in the rock. So as long as all the pieces of that bone are collected together and very carefully wrapped and labelled and taken back to the university, then we're pretty successful about putting them together again. And one particular find, which was a large block that had just what looked like isolated bones sticking out of the sides, ended up actually being a rock that encased a partial skeleton of one of these little dinosaurs. And it was the most exciting feeling to disclose the little bones as I chipped away the rock. And it's something that you don't experience every day.
It was really exciting to us too, because we got a little message. My husband and I, who work on the fossils, were overseas. And the reason we were overseas is because when you find these bones, if you don't have very many of them, you have to actually compare them to other dinosaurs around the world. So we had picked 2 or 3 museums, one in Canada, one in the United States, that we went to compare bones of what we'd found in Australia. And we got a fax from Lesley, and she said, "I've got a surprise waiting for you when you get home." And so, in fact, we came home. She wouldn't tell us what it was. She would not give us a hint as to what she had found. When we came home, we went into the lab, and there was a lovely black bit of velvet over something, and we weren't allowed to look at that until she actually came into the lab. And what we found, which was when we took the black velvet off, was about 5 blocks that were all back together, and in it was a partial dinosaur skeleton. And if careful notes had not been taken in the field as to exactly where those rocks came that contained the dinosaur bones, that skeleton probably would not have been put back together. So it's very, very important to take information in the field about where the dinosaurs come from or where any bones come from, what kinds of rocks they're in. And Andre, who has been doing work in Russia, in central Russia, on a series of animals more ancient than dinosaurs, does exactly that kind of work. He takes a look at the rocks, he takes a look at the bones and where they're placed in the sequence he's looking at, and he comes up with some ideas about how these animals died and what kind of an environment that they lived in. And I'd like Andre to just give us some idea of what kind of sleuth work he does when he's in the field. People taking information about the animals themselves, not just getting them out of the ground, but taking information that will give us clues as to how these animals died, how these animals were transported to their burial ground. And Andre's been involved in that in central Russia, in sites older than at Dinosaur Cove, working with animals that may be our ancestors, mammal-like reptiles. So I think if, Andre, you could give us an idea of the kinds of information that you look at when you're out watching them excavate, and what kinds of questions you're trying to answer in looking at that information, it'll be really great.
Thanks, Pat. Even though the bones are older and the rocks are different in Russia, the same information can be obtained from the rocks that we study as geologists, and looking at the bones and the way they're placed in the rock. Now, in Russia, I found rocks that were mudstones and gave an indication of a low-energy river environment or a floodplain. And overlying this were river channels that you could actually look in the cutting that the river makes and see an actual channel, an ancient channel.
That's sort of a lens-like
Yeah,
affair. I mean, you look at the
structure.
side of the cliff of a modern river and you see these ancient sediments. There's a lens-like structure, and that's the base and the filling of an ancient channel.
Yeah.
Now, Andre, can you tell us the difference between the kind of bones that you find in those channels and the kind that you find out on the floodplain, and what clues that gives you to how the animals died?
Well, basically, the floodplain is a much lower environment, lower energy environment than your river channel, and the river channel, being a lot faster river, flows faster, would, if an animal died near the river and got transported along, it would disarticulate the bones. It would tear them apart, it would smash them against other rocks. And when they've eventually got deposited, these bones would turn to fossils, and the fossils would be found in a disarticulated, in a separated way. And the bones found on the floodplain would be just, the animal die on the floodplain, die in mud, and just stay where it was buried.
In actual fact, at this site that you found, some of these animals got bogged. Didn't you find them with their legs down in the mud so that their toes had gone out on that floodplain and it got stuck in the mud?
Yeah, we don't actually exactly know that they were bogged in mud, but there's a very good clue that because we find them in the standing position, as if they were on all fours instead of lying on their side, that they just died, or just flat out on their bellies, that these animals were actually bogged in mud, standing up in mud, trying to get out of it, as if your car was bogged in mud, or as if an animal was bogged in a mud trap that you would see today.
So it's really important when you're in the field to take that kind of information. If you wait till you get back in the lab after you've collected the material, then you can't get that kind of information. And another thing that Andre does too is he takes orientation on bones. The river may be flowing in a certain direction, and if the bones are deposited, they will either line themselves up parallel to the current or actually perpendicular to the current. So if you take measurements on those bones, which he does, you get an idea.
Yeah, you have to look at the bones, and you have to see the orientation of the backbone. If it's a whole skeleton, you can also see separate bones such as the skull, and see how that's been orientated. And once you find the orientation of these bones, you can even have a good clue about the way the river's been flowing, or which part of the river the animal has died in.
There's almost an infinite number of things that you can ask about them. So in fact, at the end of the day, you kind of have to decide when to quit, but you can look at the bone surface, for instance, and you get an idea whether the skeleton has laid out on the surface for a while and weathered, whether it's smooth, the bone is smooth, or whether it's cracking. But all of this, the important aspect of it is all of it has to be looked at when you're in the field. You cannot do this so much when you get back into the lab. And that kind of brings us to an end of this segment on how things are discovered, how things are collected in the field, and the kind of information that you're asking of those skeletons and the sediments that surround them to come up with a picture of what has happened in the past. So now we've given you an idea of what we do. It's your chance to ask us some questions. So you can phone or fax in right away, and we'll do our best to give you some answers. Hello, we've just come back from the break and we have a number of questions that have come through both on the phone and the fax. And the first one is from Elisa from Lauriston Girls Grammar, and we need your question.
I was just wondering how, if there are two dinosaurs in the one spot and all the bones were crunched up, how would you know which one came from which dinosaur and how to put them together?
That's a really good question, and it takes a lot of years to be able to try and sort that out. First of all, you have to know a lot about dinosaur bones all over the world, and you have to know the different shapes the bones have so that you can sort out what that shape goes to what kind of dinosaur. Lesley has to put them all back together again in order for you to even make that kind of comparison. But it really takes a long background in knowing what the shapes of dinosaur bones are to get them into the right category. So, a lot of study. Now we have another question from Stephen at St. Francis Xavier.
I was wondering how many dinosaurs have been found at Dinosaur Cove?
I'll let Lesley answer that question. Stephen?
Well, Stephen, there are a number of hypsilophodont dinosaur bones that have been found. Hypsilophodont is a name given to a small bipedal herbivorous dinosaur, and hypsilophodont just means high-crowned tooth. As well as that, we've also found evidence of large theropod dinosaurs and small theropod dinosaurs. And so we have quite a number, and each time we excavate, we find more dinosaurs.
Thank you, Stephen and Elisa. Now we have another question from Catherine at Warrigal North Primary School.
Well, I was actually wondering what made you start looking in Inverloch for the bones?
I think I'm going to give that question back to Lesley, too, because she's our Inverloch lady. She's the lady of Inverloch to tell you about how we got going there.
Inverloch was found, or the site at Inverloch was found after a long period of prospecting, which we began in 1988. And it just meant actually going down to the shore platform on the rocky platform at around Inverloch and as far east as and west as San Remo, and just looking along the shore platform for bones that were sticking out of the rock. And it wasn't until 1991 that when we came to the Inverloch area that we actually found a lot of bones sticking out of the shore platform, and we knew then that we had a really good fossil find.
I've just gotten some faxes in here. One of the faxes has several questions. I'll pick a couple. This is from St. Peter Chanel Primary School in Deer Park. One of the questions is here. It says, "Hi, my name's Frankie, and my question is, where have you found the most dinosaur bone in Victoria?" I'll pass that again back to Lesley.
We found most of our dinosaur bones. In fact, all the dinosaur bones in Victoria are found along the coast. And the reason for that is the erosion rate along the coast is far quicker than anywhere else in the inland of Victoria. And therefore the bones are being exposed constantly, which is why we have to keep prospecting, keep looking all the time.
And we have one more question from St. Peter Chanel, and that is, "Hi, our names are Graham and Johnny, and we would like to know, how do you know the color of dinosaur skin?" I'll give that to Andre.
Thanks, Pat. Well, we can't be sure about dinosaur skin because we don't have actual skin preserved that we can look at to show us the colour. We have skin impressions, and we can guess at the colour of the skin, and artists do this by looking at modern animals like modern lizards and sometimes the colour of birds' feet, which is a reptilian scaly skin, and so that's a good guess. And also by looking at the types of animals these dinosaurs were, if they were hunters or if they were herbivores, and what role what colour skin that would be most suited to their role as predators or prey. And then if you get an artist just making these colours on the picture, it's just their best guess in collaboration with the scientists, but we can't be really sure.
Thanks for that question. We have another question from Craig at Albany Rise Primary School. Craig, what's your question?
Hello? I'd like to know, what are the odds of finding a group of skeletons in any one place?
They're pretty slim, and if you were a gambler, you really wouldn't put much money on it. But you can at least narrow down where to look for articulated, in other words, skeletons altogether, by looking in the right kind of rocks. And the right kind of rocks are rocks that represent really quiet environments like lakes and swamps like that, your chances of finding skeletons in places like that are pretty slim. But if you find bones, they're very often together. So you really wouldn't want to put a lot of hope into it, but that's what paleontologists do. They just have to keep trying. Thanks for that question. And we have another question from Stuart at Dandenong North Primary School. Stuart, what's your question?
When you find the bones, do they just click in, or do you need to glue them with some, like, if you do need to glue them, what do you glue them with?
Okay, I'm going to turn that question over to Lesley. She's the head gluer at Monash.
Well, most of the bones that we find are broken, which means that once they've been prepared out of the rock, which is my job, I then glue them back together, and I actually use super glue, which is the best glue that I've ever found for gluing together dinosaur bones.
Okay, there's another question from Douglas at Camberwell Grammar School.
Hi, I was wondering how many complete dinosaur skeletons have been found in Australia?
The last time I counted, there were about 6, and not all of those were complete. Our best, most complete dinosaur is Muttaburrasaurus from up in Queensland, but we really don't have a lot, and we really need to find a lot more. So you've got to get out there and look for some. Thanks for that question. We've now got some more faxes in. We have a question from Omar Khan from Melton West Primary School. How long have you been learning about dinosaurs? Well, I've been learning about dinosaurs for 51 years. I'll let Andre tell you how long he's been learning about dinosaurs.
I've been learning about dinosaurs for about 20 years, but my education started at school, just like yourself. I got a really good interest in dinosaurs when I was in about year 7, and then went on to university about 6 years ago and started to learn about dinosaurs in a lot greater detail. So
Okay,
a long time.
we have another question here from Liz Anderson? Yes, Liz Anderson from Greenvale Catholic Primary School. What's the biggest dinosaur found in Australia? And I'll give Lesley that question.
I imagine that the largest dinosaur would be Muttaburrasaurus from Queensland, which was a large plant-eating dinosaur, which was probably about 7 meters long. Although we do have a large dinosaur from here in Victoria, which was a type of Allosaurus dinosaur, which would have been almost that big.
Okay, we have another question. It may be our last from Barry at Lalor North. What's your question, Barry?
How do you tell the size of a dinosaur?
How do you tell the size of a dinosaur? Well, it depends upon how much of the dinosaur you've got. If you have a whole skeleton, it's pretty easy to do that. You just simply measure up the bones. But if you have an individual bone, what you then have to do is go to the nearest relative that you can find in another collection and take that individual bone, like a femur or a tibia or something, and then assume that all the rest of the skeleton is about the same size relative to that bone. It's very hard when you just have a little bit of a dinosaur, but it's a lot easier when you have a whole thing. And I think we have time for one more question, and this is from Amanda at Warrangata Primary School, Wangaratta, sorry. What happens to rock around skeletons? Do you throw that away after removing the skeleton? I'll give that to Lesley.
Well, when we remove the bone from the rock, if the rock is still fairly large, we then break it up into smaller and smaller pieces, just in case there happens to be some more bone or even some small teeth that are still trapped inside the rock. So we eventually do remove all the rock and break it down until we are positive that there are no more bones in that rock.
We're going to have to stop there. Thank you for all those wonderful questions, and we'll now have we'll go on to part 2, and there'll be time later for more questions, so keep calling in and faxing. Welcome back to the second part of the program. What we'll look at now is what happens to the bones once you get them in from the lab, once you get them into the lab from the field, and at such processes as the preparation of them out of the rocks, the making of molds and casts, for 2 reasons. One, for putting them on display so that the public can see what you've dug up, and also for sending around to other scientists who may want to study them. Now, you may say, why don't you just send them the real bone? Well, the reason you don't send them the real bone is the fact that those real bones are rare. Remember that we only have found 5,000 in Victoria, so that you want to make a very, very high-quality cast that can be sent around to other people to look at. And in the case of exhibitions, you want to have a cast that looks just like the real thing, but that is very lightweight, so that you can mount it and put it into a skeleton that doesn't weigh 5 tons. So Lesley Kool, who is the head preparator at our Monash lab, will take a look now very specifically at how she prepares the bones out of the rock, give you an idea what the bones actually look like in the rock, and how she makes molds and casts. And after that, then we'll go on and look at how you mount an exhibition from the expedition. Lesley, would you like to tell us a bit about what do you do once these rocks come back in from the field? How do you get them out, and how do you make them so that they're useful in exhibitions and for research?
Thanks, Pat. Well, when a bone comes back from the excavation site, this is what we see. This is a cross-section through a small bone, and this is the type of rock that we often find the bones in, especially here in Victoria. Now, the first thing that we have to decide is how to prepare that bone. Now, in some cases, some bones are found in a limestone, which means we can actually dissolve the rock away using an acetic acid. But the rock that we find the bones in here in Victoria is a sandstone, which means it has to be removed mechanically. And this is a typical tool that I use out at Monash University. It looks like a little pen, but it's actually a compressed air tool. The air comes in through the valve here and makes the tool vibrate, and the vibrations from the tool is what we use to actually chip away the rock. And you can see this is a bone that I have started preparing, and I've actually removed the bone from the rock from one side of the bone, and so you can see the bone exposed along this surface. And this process continues until I have completely removed the rock from around the bone. But in the process, I have to actually harden up the bone, because the bone is very brittle, and the vibrations from the tool that I use, if the bone wasn't hardened up, would actually destroy the bone. So in the process of removing the rock, the bone is hardened up to protect it from further vibrations, and eventually the bone is completely removed from the rock. If it's in more than one piece, as most of the bones are, then the two parts of the bone or more are then glued back together again, and we end up with a complete bone.
One thing I might point out here too is that if you ever find a bone in a rock like this, if you happen to be wandering along the coast of Victoria and you find it, you really should get in touch with Lesley, because Lesley's been working on this process for about 10 years, and it takes about that amount of time to get the experience to remove these bones from the rock. If you don't have that experience, you usually end up with a handful of powder. So
that's right.
Be aware that it takes great care to get these out, and be aware also that the bones that come out of here are very rare, and it's something that we would really like to know about. You may make some discoveries that are quite important. And now, would you like to show us how you go about making a cast of
Certainly.
these?
Now, with a simple bone, for example, this hypsilophodont femur, we can make a fairly simple mold. The mold is made from a compound called silicon rubber, which basically means it is a rubberized compound. It comes in a liquid form, which we pour over the original bone, and then it sets in about 24 hours. We then remove the bone, and from that we have a very faithful replica of the bone itself, which we can then fill with any type of casting agent. It could be a plaster of Paris, or in this case it's a polyester resin, which is a much harder product, which we can, and more durable than plaster of Paris. The larger bones, for example, this is a much larger hypsilophodont bone.
This is a real bone.
Yes, this is the real bone. This is a cast, and this is a real bone. And as you can see, this is the mold is a much larger mold than the one you saw before. And because silicon rubber is quite an expensive compound, we then decide to make a thinner mold. And because it is a thin mold and very flexible, we have to make a plaster backing on it, a plaster jacket, which will then support the mold once you've poured the casting agent in. And we can end up making duplicates and replicas of some of our most important scientific specimens. For example, this is the femur of one of our struthiomiimid dinosaurs from Dinosaur Cove. And the importance of making the cast is that because the original bones are so delicate and so special and unique, we can't afford for them to be handled too much. So by making replicas, we can make as many of these as we like, which can then be sent to other collections elsewhere in the world for comparison, or, as Pat said before, they can be used as part of an exhibition where they are displayed to the public. And so they're a very important part of the preparation process.
One thing that's quite clear is this one is very, very lightweight, whereas the bone, the original bone here, it's quite heavy. So if you put them on a scale, it would be like that. This one can be drilled so that if you want to make an exhibition specimen, you can drill a hole through it and put a wire through it, and you can actually mount these things very easily, whereas something like that, you run the risk of actually ruining the bone if you do something like that to it. The other thing you notice about it, too, when you look at it really up close, is that the detail of that specimen is really very faithfully present on the outside of the bone. So it's not as if it's a, you know, just a blob, but you've got all the detail of the cracks and the little processes, etc. And so you can actually use that to do scientific research on. So that pretty well sums up what happens when you have to prepare, get the material out of the rock. Andre's already talked in a previous session about how you interpret that rock, so you get an idea of how that bone was preserved. And I guess the final thing that we need to talk about is, if you're going to mount an exhibition from this material, what is the point of it and how do you go about doing that kind of thing? In recent years, from 1993 to 1995, there has been an exhibition that all of us have had something to do with here in Australia, together with the Russians from the Paleontological Institute in Moscow, the Great Russian Dinosaur Exhibition. Exhibitions can have many purposes, but the purpose of this particular exhibition was to present the public with some really wonderful specimens to look at, and they were the real bones. They were these kinds of things. They weren't casts, which today is a very unusual kind of situation where you have real bones on display. More exhibitions than not are casts, and you can understand why. So we put this exhibition together for a number of reasons. The first, as I've already mentioned, was basically introducing the public to material from Mongolia, the Russian material collected with the Mongolians from the 1940s up to present, and also the mammal-like reptiles, very similar to what, in fact, including some of the material that Andre is now working on as part of his master's thesis. So it was basically a show. But in addition to that, this exhibition had other purposes, and very often this is what is the case. Other purposes included putting together a whole bunch of educational materials for people like you to use to understand the evolution of mammals from mammal-like reptiles and what happened to the dinosaurs, how they went extinct, and so forth. So the exhibition put that across. And in addition to that, it was making casts of all of the material in that exhibition. So Lesley and a team of people from the Queen Victoria Museum in Tasmania were involved in making casts of everything that was in that exhibition, and that material will stay in Australia when the Russian material goes back. And finally, and something you may not be aware of, is that exhibitions like this generate funds to support science. At the moment, the funds that are being generated by that exhibition are supporting primary and secondary school education in Russia, as well as providing educational materials here, but it's also supporting a large part of the institute in Russia, the Paleontological Institute in Moscow, that has given us the privilege of having these materials outside of the country. So I hope you can see in all the different things that we've talked about that starting out with going out and finding bones, putting them into some kind of a context as to where they came from, how the animal died, how they were preserved, what kind of an environment they lived in, providing a basis for a lot of scientific research, going on from there and making copies, preparing them, making copies of them, making them available to people in general so that they understand where they came from. That's all a part of paleontology. And I must say, at my advanced age of 51, and I think Andre and Lesley at their advanced ages too, although Andre's not too advanced in age, are glad that we do what we do. What we do in paleontology is a whole lot of fun. It's a little bit like Indiana Jones sometimes, and Andre could tell you some stories about his work in Russia, and I and Lesley about our work in South America that would give you some clues as to how Indiana Jones it can become. But even more than that, it really is something we're quite interested in and will be until the day we become fossils. Well, here's your chance to phone in facts again to ask us questions about the second segment or about the first as well, and we'll do our very best to answer. Welcome back again, and we've had some people very patiently waiting on the phone. Daniel from Dandenong North Primary School, what's your question?
When you find the fossil, how do you know it is dinosaur bones?
I'll give that one to Lesley.
It's a very good question, Daniel. The way we can tell whether they're dinosaur bones or not is by the shape of the bones. And as you can imagine, if you think of a skeleton of any animal, it's made up of limb bones and backbones and the skull. And it's the different shapes of those bones that tell us what those bones came from, which particular type of animal. So by looking at the bones and comparing them with other dinosaur bones and skeletons, we're then able to identify them as dinosaurs.
Next question is from Mark at Albany Rise Primary School. Mark, what's your question?
My question is, how long does it take to make a cast of a seismosaurus?
How long does it take to make a cast of a seismosaurus? If you had the whole skeleton, it would probably, if you had a team of about 5 people, it would take you about a year to do that, because we made a cast of that animal very similar in size from China about 10 years ago, and that's exactly how long it took. Now we have Yvette from Elizabeth Street Primary School. Elizabeth? Yvette, sorry.
I was wondering, why were the only dinosaur bones you found at Dinosaur Cove?
I've lost you.
Um,
Can you repeat that? I'm sorry, Yvette, we didn't quite hear it.
The phone's gone stupid.
No?
um,
It was something about Dinosaur Cove. I'll come back to you. Sarah at Essex Heights Primary School, what's your question?
Yes, we were just wondering, the primary and secondary students are allowed to work on the digs. How many students went on the dig, and how do you get, how are you allowed to enlist?
I'll give you to Lesley, who's taking care of our Inverloch dig now. Just to say at the beginning, there's probably been, over the years, about 1,000 students of various sorts and kinds, primary, secondary, and tertiary, involved in some way. Now, Lesley can give you an idea of how you actually get involved.
To become involved in the dig, especially at Inverloch, which is where we'll be working next summer, you can come down on a field trip with your school. You can watch the crew digging and excavating at the site and certainly see the way we do it. But unfortunately, the bones are not easy to find, and so it takes an experienced eye to actually find the bones in the rock. But you're certainly very welcome to come down and watch us working down there at any time during February and March next year.
We have another question from James in Keilor. Could you give us your question?
Yeah, I'd like to ask 2 questions. The first question is, where do you store the bones you find at the digs?
You store them in a collection that is looked after very carefully. Our digs, the material is stored at the Museum of Victoria in Melbourne. And what's your second question?
If you wanted to become involved in paleontology, what basic tools would you need to go on a dig?
I'll give that to Andre. He's a student at Monash, just starting a degree, a master's degree, and he's just been on a dig in Russia, so he can give you a good idea real quick.
Well, the tools that you'd probably need to go on a dig would be a geological hammer and some brushes. Depends on what rock you're digging in, but a keen eye is the best tool, and different rocks, different bones and different rocks look differently to the eye. So just a real keen eye and some good field boots is a good thing too.
Okay, we have some faxes in here, and there's 2 faxes that kind of relate. One from Daniel Short and Laura Marshall at Oyen Primary School, a long, long way away, and a similar question from Marie at St. Peter Chanel Primary School, and the questions relate to how did dinosaurs get their names. Dinosaurs get their names in a lot of different ways. Usually you're trying to indicate a thanks to somebody who's helped to find the dinosaurs, or something about where the dinosaurs came from, or something about a character of the dinosaur itself, like Seismosaurus, which was mentioned earlier, basically was named because it's a really huge dinosaur, and so it's an earth shaker. So seismus, like seismic scale and things of that sort, relate to that. I have 2 dinosaurs I've named after my kids, not just because they're my kids, but because we drag them around to digs all over the place, so they deserve some thanks. Those are Tamimus and Leelanosaura. And another kind of name that we've given is a name to a company who helped us, gave us all the tools that allowed us to dig dinosaurs up at Dinosaur Cove. So we have a corporate dinosaur, Atlascopgosaurus. One final animal that's just been named is Qantas, which is a strange kind of amphibian from the area where Andre's been working in Russia. So names come from a lot of different places. We have another question from Ryan at Warana Park School. Are you there?
Hello.
Hello, Ryan.
I have 3 questions to ask you.
We'll have to answer just one, Ryan, so could you pick out your best?
Okay, my question is, what was the first dinosaur that you found in Australia?
The first dinosaur that I ever found in Australia, oh my goodness, I can't remember. Maybe we'll ask Lesley what the first dinosaur she ever found in Australia was.
I guess it would have to have been the Hypsilophodonts from Dinosaur Cove, the little bipedal plant-eating dinosaurs. There are a number of dinosaurs that were found in Queensland, but personally, my first dinosaur was a Hypsilophodont.
All right, we have another question about how long does it take to remove a dinosaur bone from a rock? Lesley's another person that can answer you that right now.
Well, it depends very much on the bone itself. If it's a small, simple bone, like a limb bone, it may only take a couple of hours. If it's something very delicate, like a piece of skull, it could take up to a week. And especially if it's a really small, very fragile bone, I have to prepare it using just a needle under a microscope, and that can take a very long time.
And that question was from Emma, Joanne, and Gabby from Corowa. Another question comes from St. Christopher's School in Sindel, and it comes from Dirk. How can you tell what period the dinosaurs come from? You really have to look at the rocks, and you have to look at the pollen and spores, which are the very microscopic little fossils that you get that plants produce, or you actually have to look at what we call radiometric dating. In other words, you look at minerals and find out what kinds of proportion of certain radioactive minerals are in those rocks, and that allows you to get a date, an absolute date in years on the rocks. And that's the only way you can really get at absolute dates. Now we have a few other questions coming in on the phone. Nicholas from Camberwell Grammar. What's your question, Nicholas?
Hello. I was wondering, how did you know to excavate the land around Dinosaur Cove? Like, how did you know there were going to be dinosaur bones there?
I'll let Lesley answer that question.
That was a result of a prospecting exercise that we did. We knew that the rocks were the right age because we looked at geological maps which told us that the rocks along the shore platform to the southwest and southeast of Victoria and Melbourne are early Cretaceous rocks, which means they were laid down approximately 105 to 120 million years ago, which was exactly the time that dinosaurs should have been here in Australia.
Okay, and Yvette's back from Elizabeth Street Primary. Yvette, what is your question?
I wanted to know, why were there only the bones of small dinosaurs found at Dinosaur Cove?
The reason we think that only small dinosaurs were found up until fairly recently is because the channels that collected the dinosaur bones themselves, the little river channels, were very small. And so even though there were probably larger dinosaurs around, we were just not collecting the dinosaur bones. We've got fragments of toe bones and some other things from much larger animals, but because the channels were so small, they couldn't fit literally. So it's more of a bias in the sample. Now we have, thanks Yvette for that, Anne from Ringwood Secondary College.
Yes, I'd like to ask, if you found a bone in a rock, would you get a reward because, like, they're really important and rare?
The best reward is the feeling you feel when you find that and you know you're the first person that's ever set any eyes on it. That's the best reward of the lot. Can I have another question then from Aaron in Traralgon?
How many dinosaurs have been lost or wrecked or ruined in the process of excavation?
Well, I might let Andre answer that question.
There's been many dinosaurs and dinosaur bones and other bones wrecked in the process of getting them out, because we actually have to break the rock, as Lesley mentioned before, to get them out. So usually they come in 2 pieces and Lesley tries to put them back together, but it's very difficult. So there's been many. We haven't actually counted, and sometimes we hit ourselves in the head for breaking them, but we try our best not to.
Okay, we have some more questions that have come in by fax, some from St. Joseph's College in Echuca. How many real dinosaur bones are on display in Australia? I might let Lesley give us an idea about that.
That's a very difficult question. We do have real dinosaur bones on display at the Museum of Victoria, and I believe they are on display in museums in every state, especially in Queensland. The Brisbane Museum has some beautifully preserved bones, but most of the bones, unfortunately, are in the collections in the museum, and you'd have to get permission from the department head to actually view them.
There's another question here from Dandenong North Primary School. It says, as Andre said, he works with more ancient animals than dinosaurs. What kind does he work with? This is from Stuart Clark.
I work in an area where you get some early reptiles and the ancestors to reptiles and the ancestors to mammals, mammal-like reptiles that were in the exhibition, the Great Russian Dinosaur exhibition. That's about the only animals that we get back there.
Okay, and another question from Dandenong North Primary School is how long, this is from William, how long does it take to assemble the bones after you've found them? I'll give that to Lesley.
Well, unfortunately here in Victoria, the bones that we find are isolated bones, which means they don't belong to one complete skeleton. We find bits of turtles and bits of plesiosaurs and bits of dinosaurs. So we really can't assemble a skeleton from the bones that we find in the rocks here in Victoria.
And we have probably time for one or two more questions. Claire from Templeton Primary School, what's your question?
Are any other countries like Russia going to display their dinosaurs here too?
We hope so. We hope to have some other large exhibitions from South America and some more from Russia in the near future, so keep your eyes open for those. Now we're going to have to wrap it up at the moment. Thank you all so much for these wonderful questions. We have many that we've not been able to answer, and we will stay here in the studio after the show goes off air and be happy to answer. If you want to call in, we'll talk to you on the phone. The other thing you might be aware of is in a couple of weeks' time there'll be another program, and after that a third program that follows on mammal-like reptiles and more about dinosaurs. So if you've been interested in this program, we hope to see you back.